So legibility, that was a great introduction by Susan, so I appreciate that. So, yeah, I wanted to look at the city in a slightly different way today. And we've already got this part covered. I wanted to have the lights out, and the windows are probably open, but to fill in the gaps, let's, if you don't mind, I'd like to take the risk of asking you to close your eyes. It's not too late in the semester, so hopefully you won't doze off, even though it's after lunch. But the point of it is I want you to sort of deny your sight for a little bit, so you can listen and perhaps listen a little bit closer than you typically would. So just listen hard.
Running the uni bus stop to Van Ness, and yeah.
Okay. You can open your eyes now. Wake up your neighbor. So, what'd you notice? What'd you hear? You can just call it out.
Cars.
Cars?
Okay.
Did the journey start outside and end up inside a building?
You got it. Anything else?
So we're just talking about meeting?
Yeah, that was a recorded announcement on Uni.
Footsteps?
Okay.
Sounds like an elevator.
Right. Yeah, there was an elevator at the end, and there was one ding. That's one ding for up and two dings for down. That's blind trivia. But anything else?
The walls.
I'm sorry?
The
Walls, when my cane was hitting the walls. Yeah. Did you hear my cane?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are a number of things that are happening with that in terms of how I read the city and how I read space, read architecture and the environment around me. Obviously, a lot of people think the cane is about protection or finding when there's a stair in front of you or drop or something like that, which it is. It's really good at that, and it's far preferable to hit something with your cane before you hit it with your shin. But in reality, what I'm really working and using it for is to hear the city around me. So you've probably heard the tapping of the cane, but I'm not listening to the tap where it hits the ground. I'm listening to the tap as it interacts with the environment around me. So in particular, I'm listening to how it hits walls, the sound hits walls and then comes back to me. And the point of that is that sometimes I can hear things that are in front of me. Sometimes I can hear surfaces that are off to the sides. And it can be effective for knowing when you've passed the corner of a building. Or in this particular case, when I was going down the street, I was looking for the front door of a building I hadn't been to before. And as I got to mid-block where I knew the building would be, it was a fairly large building, I heard the tapping, the sounds coming off the tip of the cane changed significantly. The reverberation time got a lot longer, and the sound got a little bit more focused. You might not have been able to hear it there. But as I walked down the sidewalk, I heard that, and I was like, oh, that must be it. Front door, and it's probably recessed in a little vestibule off the sidewalk. I turned in, went to the center of that sound, and found the door itself. I hit the storefront a couple times first, and then found the door. And the door does sound different than the storefront itself, and stepped in. And then you could hear the difference inside, how that sound coming off the tip of the cane changed a lot. There was a lot more reverberation. There was hard surfaces all around this lobby. So it's really interesting that I'm using the cane to hear the form of the city around me. But it's not just sound. I'm also sensing the ground underneath me, underfoot. Some of it you can feel through the soles of your feet. But with the cane, it's really a prosthetic. So it's an extension of my hand. So one thing it's doing is it's feeling the ground. I can feel through the shaft of the cane as it hits my palm. I can tell the different surfaces. Sometimes it's by sound, sometimes it's through touch as it comes through the cane. And you can feel different surfaces, whether it's a brick sidewalk, a concrete sidewalk, stone, asphalt, all sorts of different things. So it's really interesting, sort of the cane sort of being a really passive tool is really active as you use it to read the city around you. So there's a lot more that it does, but that's a good sort of introduction to how you could use that to read the city. And obviously with that, let me see. I'm going to slow that guy down a little bit. That's... Oh yeah, different machine. Okay, so what does that slide say? Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So, so that's all about sort of legibility in the city.
Slide 7, visual dominance and environmental sensory experience.
Part of that is to bring up the issue of sort of this environmental sensory experience, which really is thought to be 80% visual. And then all the rest, whether it's sense of smell, hearing, touch, taste, that's considered to be 20% of the environmental sensory experience. So in the case of blindness, most people think of blindness really being just, think about it being the absence of sight.
Slide 8, what happens if sight is removed?
But then the question becomes, what happens if if you don't have sight? What happens to the other senses? They're the myths that, oh, your other senses get stronger. Like you'll hear better. You become like a bat. You can like sense all this. And you get this amazing hearing. And the reality is, mechanically, nothing changes. The hearing is what it is, but what does change is your focus on it. So without the visual stimulation all around and your mind's focus on that, it's freed up to focus on the other senses. So rather than, you might think that, oh, if it's 80% sight, then perhaps it's an 80% sensory deprivation experience. But that's not really
Slide
the
9,
case.
altered sensory application without sight.
So the reality of it is, and I'm sorry, Georgina, I'm not giving you audio description. So now there are these icons that sort of proportionally show the different senses, proportionality of senses. In this case, those other senses sort of expand to fill the total of that sensory experience. And the reality of it being that you're, actually in my case, I found that although I lost all sight, and I also lost all sense of smell, I found that my environmental sensory experience since that is more multisensory than it ever was before. So I don't go around tasting too many cities or buildings, maybe through the restaurants, but so it's really the sense of smell and the sense of touch, and sound. Sorry, a sense of sound and the sense of touch. As I move around through space. And there are other things like this haptic sense, having a sense of your body's position in space, movement, kinesthetic sense. So there are other things that are going into play, and I'm so much more aware of that than I ever was before. To the point one time I got out of a friend's car in San Francisco who was taking me back to my office. I told him where I was getting out and where I needed to go, and he stopped there, let me out. One foot hit the ground, and I'm like, wrong corner. And it's simply because of the angle at which my foot hit the ground. And I knew that was too steep for my block. Let him go and just walk the extra 2 blocks to get there. But it's really interesting how you can really read the city with quite good clarity by an understanding through these other senses. And it's very much like all the visual landmarks that you have cited, but you start to have other more multisensory landmarks to work with. Slide 10, city of the pines. So with that, sometimes I like to pose the question, working off a story by H.G. Wells called The Land of the Blind. In this sort of fictional city high up in the mountains in a valley, secluded, separated from the rest of society, and everybody had lost their sight for generations, and then their whole sort of indigenous architectural forms and landscape starts to form around that. So I posed the question, what would happen if we were to consider the city for the blind today? And if you were to take all the legally blind people in the United States and have them in one place, it would be the third largest city in America. It would be third behind New York, LA, and then just a new city ahead of Chicago. Now, I'm not proposing that. I'm merely suggesting that as a way to think about what that city would be like, to think what kind of systems, what might be there to make a livable city, a delightful city for people that don't, for citizens that don't see. So it's just an interesting rhetorical question that I thought I'd throw out there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Georgina.
Okay. Chris told me his chair is about to explode, so thank you for that. Exciting.
Please get dull. I'll
That's
sit
okay,
hard
thank
to the lower right.
Yeah. And now I'm pondering moving to the city of the blind. What are we going to name the city, Chris? Downeyville.
No.
I'll say I hadn't heard Chris's recording before, and what struck me, and so this is a blind reading of that recording, is that Chris is a tapper, and I am a dragger. Right? So Chris, there are different techniques to using a cane, and for me, what I find effective is dragging. And although I do use oral perception for navigation, I don't do it quite in the same way. So it was interesting kind of having this perception of, oh, here's something that's sort of familiar, but it's sort of not me. So it's as if I was taking on a different embodiment. So that was kind of interesting. Anyway, I wanted to go back to the idea of legibility and to make a couple of points about what Susan was raising about the use of that term, that metaphor, really, to talk about legibility, to talk about cities and city planning and how people move through and understand cities, and a metaphor that connects that with reading. And as Susan made the point, of course, you can read with your eyes. It's the typical way people do it, but you can read with your hands, you can read with your ears. You heard Chris's screen reader, which is how many blind people read computers and smartphones and all the other devices. But the other point to make about reading, and this is coming to you from an English professor, is that reading is a linear activity, right? When you have a text, when you have a book, you start at the beginning and you go through to the end. You start at the top of the page, you go through to the bottom. In reading English, you start from the left and you go to the right. So there's a very clear pattern that you follow, versus, say, the way a sighted person takes in an image, a photograph or a painting or whatever it is, which is usually construed to be something that you do instantaneously, as it were in a single gulp. Your eyeballs just take it in. Anyway, so this metaphor I actually find is quite, resonates with my experience of navigating cities. That for me it is a linear event. And which means that I have in my repertoire of getting around cities a sort of sense of a point of a departure and an ultimate goal. And my sense of how to get there is not in any way related to an aerial view that you would have in a map, either a visual map or even a tactile map. But it's much more analogous to the feature on your Google Maps, which you may not actually use, which is you have the Google Map, which has the image, the aerial view of the route you're supposed to take. But if you go down to the bottom, on the bottom left, I think it is, there's a little icon that's lists turn-by-turn directions, which I bet is what you use when you're driving your car. And that's something that, that's sort of a new technology that I find quite usable and quite coherent with already the way that I navigate, that I go to the end of this street, and then I have to make a decision. Do I turn left or I turn right? And after I've done that, then there's another turn, and then there's another sequence of events. The other thing that I would say about sort of blind perception, particularly of landscape, cityscape architecture, is that, now I'm going to say something kind of essentializing about sighted people, and I don't want to offend anybody. Some of my best friends are sighted people. I come from a family of many, many sighted people, so, But what I have observed in living among the sighted for all my life is that sighted people tend to be very frontally oriented. It's as if they don't have a back. And for me, and for a lot of blind people I know, I think of myself as sort of moving in a sphere. That is to say, the sphere, what do you call that? The radius of the sphere is sort of the length of my cane. And so it is orienting me in terms of the direction that I am going. At the same time, I'm aware of what's going on around me, behind me, overhead, right? And so there's all that awareness that's partially tactile and partially oral hearing, partially olfactory smell, depending on where I happen to be. And it's all in motion. It's all going forward. So that there's a kind of awareness that my awareness is kind of shifting from what my cane is doing, what it's feeling underfoot, what my feet are feeling underfoot, the sounds that are emanating, echoing from the cane, sounds of traffic moving, the movement of other pedestrians around me, the sounds of people talking, the sounds of people perhaps talking on their cell phones, the kind of tinny sound of the music that's turned up too loud in their earbuds, right? It's a very useful navigational feature of landscape. So all of these features, I think sometimes the myths about blindness would be you'd rather be alone. But in fact, the more crowded the environment is, the easier it is to navigate, because suddenly you have all this information that's coming at you from all directions. And that with a little practice, you learn how to interpret that and how to gain the information that you need to know. The other, and this may be able to be the final thing I'll say about this, in terms of sort of mapping and navigating as a blind person. Let me put it this way. If you're lost sometime, could happen, and you need directions, good directions to get somewhere, find yourself a blind person. Because most blind people I know, if they know where something is, they will give you really, really good, detailed, turn-by-turn directions with all sorts of landmarks. There's a coffee shop at the corner, they're doing construction on that street, so you should go around the corner and then come at it from the other side. There's a mailbox that's kind of stuck out in the middle of the sidewalk, so you want to stick close to the building. And so if you really, really pay attention to those directions, you will get where you want to go. Versus, and again, I don't want to offend the sighted people in the room, but sighted people tend to give directions like this. Well, you go right, it's like straight ahead, and you keep going, and then you kind of go sort of that way a little bit, and then it'll be right there. It'll be right there. It's just like past, there's this thing, and then it's just past that thing. So when you get to the thing, And it's blue. So you can use it, it's like really blue. Okay. I defy you to get there on your own. So should we entertain questions? Would that be a good?
Yeah, and
Okay.
today I'm just going to start because you
Okay.
have started with such a great theme of linearity, which relates to narrative. And I would like to ask Chris, since you have spent your career thinking in plan view in part and looking at the whole, do you share Georgina's kind of linear approach to navigation, or is it more combined in your mind with the plan view?
It's somewhat combined, or it depends. You know, there are a lot of areas that I go to in the Bay Area that I know cited and would know through maps very well. And I'll think in terms of sort of walking along the map in my mind, sort of a cognitive map of that space. There are other places I'll go where I don't have that understanding of the area, and it's not the sort of the planned view experience at all. So sometimes I just feel like I'm a sighted person walking around without sight, you know, temporarily, because it's like it's all out there, and I can imagine it quite vividly around me. Other times it's like, okay, now we're really exploring into something different and new. And then it is much more of the turn by turn, sort of linear reading or progression through space.
Great, so questions? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mitch. I'm a visitor. So you both talked about the design aspects of the street and the other people on the street that help you in a practical way get from point A to point B. And I think there are things for sighted people that also help, wayfinding signs, you know, etc. But I wonder, like for sighted people, there are things that don't really necessarily improve your ability to get somewhere, but make the experience more pleasurable. Street murals, bike racks that are imaginative, etc. And I'm wondering if there are comparable things that would make your experience more pleasurable in getting there, but not necessarily be of practical use to do so.
Open doors. You know why? Because in a city, on a city street, when the doors are open, I'm more likely to get olfactory clues about what's there, which is useful for navigation, but it's also just kind of pleasurable. It's like, oh, there's a bookstore. Oh, there's a flower store. Oh, that restaurant. I wonder what kind of food that is. And oh, you know, so that there's that sort of pleasure for me. I mean, that wouldn't be a pleasure for Chris necessarily.
The open door works though.
The open door works. It's also like the sound. I mean, there's a kind of pleasure in different soundscapes in a city. You know, that sometimes you're walking past and you hear music, and sometimes the pleasure of turning off a busy street that's noisy, a lot of traffic, onto a quiet street, and sort of marveling at, wow, it's really quiet on this street. That's amazing, because we're just like half a block from a really noisy street. And then kind of differences of what you might hear coming through open windows, not even at street level, but above, you know, sort of domestic spaces. So you might hear somebody has a television on, or there's the clink of dishes, and they're having their Sunday dinner or whatever. So those are things that, I mean, it's not something a city planner can necessarily offer. Must have your doors open. And here in California, it would be a more feasible thing than other parts of the world.
Yeah, but it is, you know, that sense of pleasure and delight in the city. You know, a lot of it, you know, on one level, to the extent that you can get through it effectively, and it's not a really confusing environment, then you can sort of enjoy the space around you. The sounds, not my case, the smell, the sounds, just all the activity around. And you know, I know in my case, after losing my sight, my favorite place in the house became the front stoop, because it was a dynamic environment. It was, you know, cars going by, kids going by, all sorts of sounds, birds overhead. You know, the air is moving. You could hear the sounds of the wind blowing through the trees. And so that sort of the dynamics of the outdoor space of the city, it really, it sort of enlivens your mind and connects you to the world around. So the city just, there's so much going on within it to enjoy, to be active, to be aware of all around you. So, but I've the doors, the open doors. I remember one time I was looking for the Apple store in downtown San Francisco, just off Market Street. I was going down Stockton, and I just walking down the sidewalk, and all of a sudden I heard the roar. And it's like, that's the Apple store roar. It's like the old store. And you can just, it's like, what is going on in here? It's like, you don't hear the music, you just hear all the people inside. Turn right into it. It's like, Apple store there? Yep, it's okay.
Here's another question here.
So when I started biking around the city, I had a shift in experience that kind of reflects what you guys have been talking about, where, for example, I was more aware of things behind me because I was worried about a car coming up behind me. I'd pay more attention to the texture of the road I was riding on. I would know neighborhoods by the smell, like, oh, there's that house that's always making burnt cookies. And so I wonder how much of the experience is getting out of the car, getting out of the encasement, how much is engaging in the city in this active level, in your opinion?
Getting out of the car is just incredibly liberating, and it's so much more connected to the city and the experience of being in the city or being in your neighborhood, being on the street. You encounter so much more of the world around you by doing that. So that's been sort of great. You get off the hook of having to run errands quickly. I can run errands, but it might take a while.
Yeah. The cities that I know best in the world, I grew up in New York City. I've spent a lot of time in Paris, and it's no accident. They're great pedestrian cities. And other cities that I've lived in that are, closer to car culture. I lived in Columbus, Ohio for 12 years. I have very little sort of memory or perception or sense of the layout of the city or where things were in relation to each other. Even though I intellectually understood the sort of grid pattern of the city, but my perception of it was very, it's hard to describe, it's just sort of, distant, it's like faint, it's sort of this faint memory of locations that I would go there, I would go there, I would go there, but I not having that memory of the sort of step-by-step, block-by-block relationship. And also cities that are more subservient with car culture. There's the whole phenomenon of the parking lot in front of, what do you call that when the parking lot is right up to the sidewalk in front of the store
Like
rather
a
than...
strip mall.
Yeah, exactly. And so that vanishes all significance to my perception of the city, because one block is like the next. Even though to a sighted person it's like, oh, well, that's where that store is and that's where that restaurant is. But to me it's just like one parking lot after another. And I happen to be on a sidewalk all by myself because everybody else is in a car. So, it does sort of, I think Chris's point about the city of the blind is that it would also be a nice place for the sighted people. That it would have all these qualities that are currently touted, this sort of livability for cities, which would be sort of pedestrian friendly and sort of vibrant commercial spaces close to residential spaces and so on.
Yeah, and not to knock the knock on Dallas or anything, but if you were imagining the city of the blind, it would be much more like New York or downtown San Francisco than like downtown Dallas.
Yeah.
And there is definitely that sort of livability in terms of the scale of the street, the activity on the sidewalk, the proximity of the commercial interest or front doors to the sidewalk. You know, they're not set back or hidden around the corner, or God forbid, not there because they're only connected to the parking garage or parking lot. So it's, and it's, sometimes I think, you know, if you know, we, with Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, there's all these regulations about access and things, but I was like, okay, if we were to imagine what those design regulations would be for an accessible city if you were blind, you know, there would be no strip malls. You know, it's a complete different thing. You want that door on the sidewalk,
Yeah.
not to the opposite side of the parking lot, as Georgina was explaining. And you want greater density, you know, streets that you can actually, you know, cross, you know, today and not sometime tomorrow.
Not 6-lane highways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we don't get to do that